And that was the rationale that the court used to outlaw child pornography generally. These pictures are made without using any children at all. The act, Kennedy says, prohibits speech that records no crime and creates no victims by its production. He says, that which the court clearly believes, that sexual abuse of a child is a most serious crime and an act repugnant to the moral instincts of a decent people. And Congress clearly has the power to protect children from actual abuse. But the prospect of crime, the court says, by itself does not justify laws suppressing prohibited speech. This may remind you of things that we've considered before in this course. And the fact that the materials can be considered a crime, even though they don't involve real children, without any inquiry into the work's redeeming value, without that element of the obscenity definition, creates a serious problem. A problem of overbreadth, that the law is overbroad in criminalizing speech that is protected. Then the court, Kennedy deals with the government's argument that even virtual images, not involving real children at all, can lead to actual child abuse. That's the government's argument, part of the government's argument. And Justice Kennedy said the causal link between images and abuse is not proved. It is contingent, it is indirect. And in fact, the social science evidence does not show a causal connection between viewing any kind of sexual images, child porn or grown-up porn, and sexual crimes. That is, no connection between viewing the stuff and abusing the child, no connection on the adult level between viewing the stuff and rape, for example. The social science evidence doesn't support it. Anecdotally, there's a lot of that, but especially in the child pornography arena, it appears from the social science research, which is very hard to do with child pornography because researchers can't have the materials either. There's no exemption in the law for academics. Anybody who possesses this stuff is a criminal. But there have been ample opportunities to interview convicted child abusers and so on, and others. And it appears that most people who view child pornography do it for masturbation purposes and don't involve themselves with real children at all. Anyway, Justice Kennedy includes no causal link between the material and the actual crimes. As for the use of the pictures as a seduction tool, Kennedy says, well, child abusers use cartoons, they use video games, they use candy, they use money, they use all kinds of things that induce the kids to have sex with them. The fact that those things can be used for seduction doesn't give the government the power to outlaw them. A law against candy, a law against cartoons, because they can be used as seduction tools, doesn't make any sense. And then Kennedy says a very strong First Amendment opinion. He says the tendency of speech to encourage unlawful acts is not a sufficient reason for banning it. The law was basically aimed at the evil of planting bad ideas and impure thoughts, but government is not allowed to control thought. Citing what? Brandenburg, right? Even advocating child abuse can't be made a crime under Brandenburg. So the court concluded that the law was unconstitutional because no real children were used in the production. It was a 6-3 decision. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor would have upheld a narrow provision on computer-generated images. Well, that's what Congress has done on these attempts. They got 1 out of 4. They won the library case, but none of the others. And the library case was quite different because it was not a criminal prohibition on speech. It was simply strings that governments put on subsidies that they granted to libraries. Now pull back from all of this detail and look at where we stand with regard to freedom of speech and the press considered in the world context. There are a couple of organizations that rank all of the countries in the world on how well they do on freedom, and in particular on freedom of the press. One of them is Freedom House. That's a nonprofit located in New York, started by Eleanor Roosevelt a long time ago, and they do a survey every year and rank all the countries in the world. They rank them on freedom generally, but that's not just speech and press. That includes political freedoms of all kinds, criminal law generally, and not limited to speech. But with regard to the press, the most recent Freedom House survey shows that the United States is not number 1 in the world. We do not have the freest press in the world, I regret to say. The United States was tied for 24th with the Czech Republic, behind countries like Estonia, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. And the top 5 countries on freedom of the press in the world were all the Scandinavian countries: Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And the other organization that ranks countries by how free they are is Reporters Without Borders, which is a French-based organization that usually is anti-American, but in their most recent ranking ranked as 20th, behind Germany, behind Malta, behind Australia and Japan, and they too have the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Iceland, and so on, ranked right at the top. These surveys, they do some narrative reporting about each country and so on, and they acknowledge that the United States has some unusually strong features protecting freedom of the press, freedom of speech and the press. They are the 3 that we've identified before. That is the Pentagon Papers rule against prior restraints, injunctions against publishing certain information, speaking, saying certain things. You may have seen that in the UK, within the last year, there have grown up the phenomenon of super injunctions, they're called, which prohibit anybody from repeating information that might infringe the privacy of famous soccer players, for example, about their affairs. And these soccer players get court orders that order the country not to put out those rumors, not to say those things. Okay, under English law, certainly not under American law as established in the Pentagon Papers case. The second feature that we're, if not unique, stronger than most other countries, is the Sullivan Rule, New York Times versus Sullivan, and the protection that we all have to criticize government without getting sued for libel. And the third feature is the Brandenburg Rule that allows us to advocate ideas that are terrible, as long as we don't incite imminent lawless action. The Freedom House survey pointed to problems in the American freedom scene with regard to speech and press, and mentioned, for example, the concentration of ownership of the media in small number of big corporate hands that is not a freedom-favoring feature of our system. They pointed to the decline of the newspaper industry, where so many newspapers have closed, and have closed, for example, foreign bureaus as cost-saving measures, so we don't get international news the way we used to. They point to the confidential source problem that we've looked at ever so briefly, that there's no federal protection for reporters who are subpoenaed to disclose their confidential sources. They pointed to the FCC fines for indecent material that we looked at as a non-freedom promoting phenomenon of our system. What makes a country's press free is certainly not the words in the Constitution. I mean, every country in the world has something in their Constitution. North Korea, every country has something in their Constitution that looks like it provides for freedom of speech and the press, or that says that it protects freedom of speech and the press. They give it lip service, but the reality is it isn't there. I think press freedom has to include, at a minimum, autonomy of the press to decide what's news and how to cover it. It has to include the ability to acquire information, and under our law, with no constitutional right, no First Amendment right of access to information, what we've got is the Freedom of Information Act, which is pretty good. It's probably better than average around the world, but it's not part of the Constitution the way it is in Sweden, for example. And the press needs the ability to criticize government without fear of punishment or harassment or libel suits or death. And that ability to criticize government has to be true both in law, that the government acknowledges the people's right to criticize it, and in fact. I used to think that government ownership and operation of the broadcast media was a sign of non-freedom. It seemed to me obvious that if the government runs the show, the press is not free, the broadcast media are not free, that it necessarily restricted their freedom, and that private ownership was the only way to ensure freedom. But all countries at least license and regulate broadcast radio and television, and some of them, like the BBC in the UK and the Canadian, the CBC in Canada, Sweden, lots of other countries, have really good, high-quality, publicly owned and operated broadcast media that are free to criticize government. It seems like the key to whether that works is whether they have the professional autonomy to make the decisions about what's news and how it'll be covered. Of course, if the goal is to ensure freedom of the press rather than quality of the press, the freedom probably has to include the freedom to be trashy and shallow and superficial and appeal to the lowest common denominator. 20 years ago, right about now, I went as a member of a small delegation to the brand new Republic of Armenia that had just come out of decades under communist rule as part of the Soviet Union, had declared their independence the previous fall, and the newly democratic country wanted to establish a modern democratic constitution. What they had was the old Soviet one. And so they asked for help, and a few of us went over there to talk to the people about ideas that they might use in their new constitution, which they had not put pen to paper yet. They were thinking about the ideas. And I was interested in freedom of speech and the press, and I asked the Attorney General, Mr. Stepanian, in Armenia, what they were going to do about a Bill of Rights and freedom of speech and the press. He laughed at me, and he said, they have complete freedom because we have a law that governs the press, that gives them complete freedom. The only thing they can't do is publish official secrets, and we don't have an official secrets list yet. I said, well, gee, I'd really like to see that law. And they didn't have one to show me. They were essentially a paperless office at the time, not because they were so technologically advanced, but because they didn't have any paper. You'd walk into a government office and all the desks would be bare. No computers there either, but no paper. But they finally dug one up, and I got it at the airport on the way out of the country and read through it. And it was an attempt to create a law that created a press that was both free and responsible. They recognized that they needed a free press in order to have a functioning democracy, but they wanted a press that was also responsible, that wouldn't upset their fragile new democracy. And that really isn't doable. And it reminded me then, as it does now, of what Chief Justice Berger said in the Tornillo case, the Miami Herald case. The press responsibility is desirable, but like all other virtues, it cannot be legislated. My version of that is that a press that's required by government to be fair is not free. And I'll take freedom over government-compelled fairness any day. So I hope that I've left you with some appreciation for this wonderful gift that you've been given in freedom of speech and the press, and a sense of how fragile it is. People are always going to be trying to chip away at it, and they'll always have some good reason, some competing value, some worthy cause that requires trimming back on speech and the press. Your job is to resist that, but most of all, to live your lives in a way that you will deserve those freedoms. So That's what I've got to say for this course. Please fill out your evaluations. I take them very seriously. Don't do a thing until I'm out of the room.